Charlie Tuna here with a lady I met on the phone about a half a year ago. And it was a sad occasion because she called me and asked if I'd do a little tribute to her dad, Bob Keane, who was one of the pioneers in this business of radio when it came to rock and roll. Chanelle Keane joins us. Chanelle, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
A little better than when we first talked, right?
Yes, yes.
That was the day after your dad had passed away, Bob Keane, right?
Mm-hmm. About 12 hours later or so, yeah.
And for those who don't know who Bob Keane is, this man had a remarkable effect on our business. Well, for one thing, his most famous discovery was Ritchie Valens, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's very true.
And what happened? He saw him and saw the excitement at a theater one night that this kid was causing?
Yes, he went out to high school in Pacoima, I think, and heard about it through a friend or a colleague. And he went out and saw, I remember him telling me all these girls were going wild and screaming. And he said, you know, who's up there? And he kind of looked up and it's just one kid doing a bunch of riffs and just going crazy on the guitar and singing with just passion. And he said, you know, that was Ritchie Valens. He's like, but Valenzuela.
Valenzuela. And he shortened it, though, to Valens, right?
Yes, because he was the first major Latin singer to really make it out in L.A., on the radios especially. He just wanted to make him more commercial, and give him more of an opportunity, especially at that time.
It was such a brief relationship, though, because this was like, well, they made a movie out of it. Later we'll talk about it. But he discovers this kid, and the kid is singing this one song, come on, let's go, and he couldn't ever get anything beyond that. Come on, let's go, and he had that riff, and then your dad said, well, we've got to have a beginning and an ending to this, right?
Yeah, I remember asking my dad about just what it was like with Ritchie in particular, because I remember he would tell me stories and he'd start crying and he would tell me about, I only knew him briefly. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I think it was 13 months and he had several hits.
Donna went to number 2, right?
Yeah, Donna was an example.
And then he comes back with La Bamba after that, which is like an anthem almost in Los Angeles.
And from what I understood, my dad told me that Ritchie didn't even want to do that initially. He was afraid it was too disrespectful or that he didn't want to offend anyone in his culture, because that was kind of like I think something about the slaves from Veracruz when they came and they would sing Bamba, and it was kind of, groups of slaves would sing this song, this just kind of like a hymn song while they were working or whatever it was, and so that's how Ritchie knew it. And my dad said, hey, this is a great song, are you kidding? Let's La Bamba, let's make it into a rock and roll song, which was typical my dad.
Yeah.
And once again, he commercialized it and he convinced Ritchie to do it. And he said to me, you never know. Just give it a try and look what happens.
I know. And then, of course, look what happened at February Day when the plane crashes and Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and Buddy Holly, as they call it, really immortalized in song the day the music died, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'll always remember he said to me, it was just heartbreaking because Ritchie always said, oh, Bobo, I love your overcoat. And he was, cold. And he says, and they found him wearing my dad's overcoat. And, for my dad, that was like, just bowled him over. That was just like the last memory. And he tried to convince Ritchie not to go on the plane and, all this thing. And, and they find him. They were able to identify him initially because of the coat, the overcoat, because they, that was my dad's last kind of, I would say, gift to him.
Your dad was devastated because he thought of Ritchie as his son, really.
He did. He did, very much.
Very close to him.
Very much. And Ritchie looked at my dad, or, considered him as a father, because my father gave him things, he gave him his family, their home, and a car, and he really showed him what it was like to really be successful and what he could do with his art and his music, his talent.
Listen to these artists that he is responsible for. Bob Keane, your dad. Bobby Fuller 4, which was another tragedy because he just gets a big hit with him, I Fought the Law, and then, less than a year later, a mysterious death with Bobby.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I just feel like with my dad's, artists, they were just like shooting stars, most of them. They were just, my father discovered them and basically groomed them and trained them and helped them and just to kind of like be who they really were in the musical sense. Yeah. And then after, several months, just a short time, they kind of like, they either die off or they disappear, or whatever it is. And it's just kind of like, well, what is it now? I mean, I went to go see Fantastic Mr. Fox, and at the end of the movie is Let Her Dance, Bobby Fuller. And I'm sitting there in the theater, I'm thinking, how many years later is this?
That's right.
And there's Bobby Fuller 4, right?
Listen to some of the other artists your dad's responsible for. Barry White, another guy, right? He gave him his first break. Frank Zappa, Mothers of Invention. Glenn Campbell, I guess that was like the first job he had. Leon Russell. Arthur Lee, I Am the God of Hellfire, the Safaris, Dick Dale and the Deltones. Your dad had a lot of surf music going all the time, didn't he?
Yeah, he was a true Californian.
And Brenda Holloway, Johnny Crawford, Little Caesar and the Romans, Ron Holden, David Gates, who was part of a surfing group, country group, and what was it, the Country Boys they called themselves.
Wow, yeah.
And then Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys worked for your dad?
Yeah, I remember meeting him it was a long time ago, but it just amazed me that not only was my dad it wasn't just one kind of music. I mean, he was just involved with just a plethora of just styles. He was just, I think he was more about, you know what, this is great. Let's put it out there. That's how he was. And I think that, he had his open door policy, which was, really novel at the time. And I think just that's what happened. People thought, okay, this is one guy who's going to listen to me, because all the majors at the time weren't going to really listen because I'm a minority, or I'm just a nobody, or I don't have any background, or whatever it is. And my dad said, hey, come on in, let's listen. Let's listen to what do you have here? And he'd listen, and that was it. From that came Bobby Fuller, who drove out all the way from Texas. Barry White, I remember listening to some recordings, candid recordings, and my dad said, this guy, I bailed him out of jail and bought food and groceries, paid his rent for his family. That was how my dad was. And he said, Barry White was just like he was able to play the drums and do syncopation and arrange, and he was like a one-man show, and he was able to do everything. He's like, hey Bob, if you want me to do it, I'll do it. Whatever, we'll do this, we'll do that, and that's how they did work together. And that was the kind of guy my dad was. He was just like, anything goes.
And then Quentin Tarantino makes this movie Pulp Fiction and decides, I need to use some of this music your dad made in the movie, right?
He does.
That all of a sudden resurrects everything.
Everything. I think it practically brings him back into business. Although I think he started to get back in the industry with around the early 80s. He put out some revisions of La Bamba 82 or
and
87.
the movie came out in 87.
And the movie. So, that kind of brought him back in a little bit. But then I think it was full speed ahead with Pulp Fiction.
He wasn't real happy, by the way, just to backtrack to La Bamba, the movie. He wasn't that happy with it? Or?
No, I don't think he really was. I think he had some negative experiences with the director, but he also felt that it wasn't as accurate as it could have been. But, of course, it was very Hollywoodized and, that whole thing. But he was telling me the story about it. He's like, I thought, hey, why don't I play myself? And the joke was that, I wasn't bald yet back then, because Joe Patagliano, at the time. And with the hat, he's like, I wasn't bald yet. That's not accurate either. Oh. He used to tell me that. So, but amongst other things. I mean, I think in general, though, my dad was very happy that people all over the world got the chance to see the story of Ritchie Valens, because such a short life made such a huge impact on so many other lives. So
you know what we got to do, Chanelle, though? Chanelle gave me this book that your dad, it's an autobiography he put out, about 1996 or something like that? Or?
Yeah, maybe a little bit later. I mean, he'd written so many revisions, but finally put that book out. The
Oracle of Delphi, and his career in this business. And I was just flipping through it here, and it's got to be a movie. This has got to be a movie.
Yes, definitely. So many people have definitely asked us about that, and I would love to maybe, if the right person, right time, and everything comes around. Because, I just feel like his story is just, I've learned so much from his life, not just because he's my father, but just, the things he tells me. And, he lived a really interesting life. Very positive, very negative, ups and downs. I mean, if anything, that's what life is. Yeah. And he came out of it, and he learned a lot, and he just plowed through. I mean, that was his major thing, was just keep going. He never, it was, he came across the most amazing obstacles. Like, he almost died 3 times, and just destiny. And he just plowed through. And that's my dad. That's Bob Keane.